This conference will
All
now be
right, let me
recorded.
do a brief intro, just so you know I know a lot of Veggie Village folks, and some of you I'm sure I know, but a few of you probably don't know me and maybe haven't heard me speak. I do quite a bit of speaking at the extension. I've been a master gardener since the 2008 class. I'm co-managing the vegetable area with Flo Decker. And we're right in the middle of total remodeling of our whole vegetable garden to change it more from a trial garden to a education demonstration garden. So if you haven't been out there, put it on your to-do list. We're about 2/3 through, and we're really putting in some really neat stuff. So, okay, so there's my promo of Master Gardeners. Now, square foot gardening is something that I've been involved with a long time, and I'll tell you the history in just a minute. But I got more involved when I got into junior master gardeners. And we would go out to schools, and most of the schools didn't have very large gardens. And so we started teaching them square foot gardening because you can do a lot of planting in a small area. So we do this for a lot of the grade schools, and we even do it for the culinary school at the Conroe High School. And so it's gotten very popular, and we really enjoy doing it, and the kids enjoy doing it. So if some of this sounds like I'm talking to kids, well, that's because I'm really used to talking to children about square foot gardening, but I'm trying to step it up a notch for you all. And but the concepts are all the same, and that's what we're going to get into. This first picture I wanted to stop on because on the right hand side is the extension square foot garden. And what you probably can't tell from this picture is that there are 4 beds in here that are a little over 3 foot each. And that particular fall, this is a fall garden because as you see, we've got lettuce and kale and Swiss chard, and in the very back we had broccoli and cabbages. But in the fall, because there's so many varieties available, we actually had 36 different variety plants in this particular garden, which is why it's so colorful. Fall vegetable gardening is one of my favorite, but I will talk a little bit about spring vegetable gardening because you can use it square foot gardening any time of the year. So we'll go on now. Now, I told Jenny I would not spend a lot of time on this, but I would be very remiss if I didn't at least tell you how master gardeners want you to be a green thumb gardener. And these principles are the same no matter what kind of garden you're doing, whether you're doing a container gardening or if you're doing a big farm gardening in an acre or more. You have to do all of these things well in order to be successful at gardening. And that's what it's all about. We're trying to get the most produce out of the available space that we have. So the first thing is, of course, soil preparation and being sure we fertilize our soil and making sure that we don't over fertilize our soil and using the right components. You need to plant at the right time, and I'll show you some charts that will help you do that. The worst thing you can do is have the best garden, but if you plant the wrong thing at the wrong time, you won't be successful. You want to control weeds, diseases, and insects. That sounds easy, but that's the hardest thing to do, especially if you're doing a garden in the ground. You need adequate moisture. In Texas, that's also very hard. We go from a drought, really heat-driven time frame to a few weeks ago, we had this Arctic blast that just, decimated most of our yards terribly. But you still need moisture in your soil, and you don't want too much. And when we get heavy rains, that's very easy to do. And you don't want too little. So consistency is what vegetables like. You want to use recommended varieties. and I'll talk about a little bit about that, because some of our box stores are good at that. Some of them aren't. Some of them are taking varieties that do really well in the Midwest and further north, and they can't handle our heat and humidity. So we have some things that will help you get the recommended varieties. You want to harvest at the right time. Nothing's worse than spend all this time gardening and then you forget to pull up that carrot, and by the time you pull it up, it's it's got hair all over it, and it's very way overripe. So you want to harvest at the right time, and you want to do crop rotation, and that's another thing that's kind of hard to do. But I'll talk about all these a little bit later. Location, location. I can't stress enough how you have to have sunlight. And I know in the Woodlands, you have the same problem I do up here, is you've got a lot of trees, and sometimes sunlight's hard to come by. But vegetables need sunlight, and 8 hours or more is recommended. In the gardens at the extension, we get about 12 hours of sun, and that's why it's so easy to grow vegetables there. If anything, it's sometimes too easy because we get so much sun, and then we have to have a lot of water to compensate for that. You want good drainage, so you always want to have your beds raised. You want to be away from structures, plants, and buildings, and that includes trees. Tree roots can be the biggest problem that you have in selecting place that you're going to do your gardening, because they go about 1.5 times the height of the tree. So if you're like me and have pines in your yard, the roots are everywhere underneath the ground. So I have to raise everything to waist high beds so I can actually garden it all. And you need a source of water. The other thing, you want it visible. Now, Veggie Village, I expect everybody goes out to the gardens just like we do at the extension. So it's not visible out your back door, but it's close enough that you go to it regularly. When you design a bed, and this is just an example over on the right of a type of square foot garden, you can have almost any design you want for square foot gardening, but usually a square or rectangular size bed is pretty much what you'd want to do. It's a little hard when you're doing round beds to get squares. But you want the bed to be stable and durable. And if you're in your yard, you might want it to be attractive, so it doesn't look like. I mean, I used to tuck. I have one area with sun, and I used to tuck all my tomatoes in with my roses because they like the same kind of soil. And most people never even paid any attention that it was a tomato because they were so busy looking at the roses. So you want it to be pretty attractive so that your homeowners and other things don't have problems with it. You want soil to be as deep as you can get it, but 12 inches is probably an ideal soil depth, so that the roots can have plenty of room to grow underneath. You can use almost anything, and one of the things we've been doing out at the extension is trying a lot of different methods or different materials, not your typical just landscape timbers and things like that. So we have a whole design of cinder blocks. We call the concrete jungle because it's all concrete. But it works really well, and it's nice and stable. And a lot of plants like the fact that that those cinder blocks dry out because they don't have wet feet. We are using some metal with wood, very attractive looking beds. So there's a lot of different things you can use to build your beds, but the important thing is that it's a stable base and very durable. But you can definitely use your imagination. Growing media, that's another important thing. There's a lot of good growing media. When we did the square foot garden at the extension, we just started with bags of topsoil, sand, and compost. And I must admit, we add compost about every year, at least once a year, and that helps with the fertility as well as the drainage and everything else in the bed. But I hardly ever fertilize that garden because most of the time I don't have any time, and we actually end up with some pretty good plants in there. So once you get your soil right and you get that combination that works well for vegetables, you really don't have to use an awful lot of fertilizer. Other mixtures that work real well is a combination of topsoil and compost. Sometimes you'll need some sand or perlite so that your drainage is a little better. But for the most part, any kind of combination like this will work. There's some good raised bed materials. I don't want to promote anybody, but we've used them at the extension a little bit, and I like his mixes. It's called Kellogg's, and they're at Home Depot, and it's an organic soil, and it drains really well, yet it holds some moisture when you need it. So it's a pretty good product. But there's an awful lot of them out there, and any of them are good. You just need to amend them as you see that you're having problems. Fertilizers, compost is one of the best slow release fertilizer, and I'm sure you all use that because I know you guys try to be organic out there. But there is a lot of organic fertilizers you can use. The only difference that I've found with organic fertilizers is that you probably need to apply them more frequently. They don't seem to be as strong as your chemical fertilizers, and vegetables, especially during the growing period, when the tomatoes are just really taking off and they're starting to fruit and things, you need something pretty strong to keep them fruiting well and producing well. But we use compost a lot at the extension, and we always I call it dress our beds with compost when we start a season, and then after that we will apply fertilizer depending on the needs of the particular plants. Here's just some pictures that I thought were kind of interesting of different things that you can use to grow in. One of the things we're going to try is this one up here that's I call it cattle trough or horse trough. We're going to try a few of those out at the extension and see how well they do. But any of these sizes and shapes can be used. But when you're doing square foot gardening, it's a lot easier to do it on something like down here where it's more of a rectangular type shape. Or this one up here, or that one over there. When they get to be rounded, it's a little harder to measure, and you'll see that in just a second. Okay.
Hey, Lynn, on those cattle troughs, on those cattle troughs, did you just drill a bunch of holes in the bottom?
Well, we're going to get some used ones that are already rusted at the bottom, and so we're just going to take the bottom out.
Oh, well, there you go.
But if we weren't cheap like I am and we were going to buy them, I would drill holes in the bottom of them, yes.
Okay, thanks.
And rust is probably the biggest issue that you're going to have to deal with when you use those cattle troughs, and we aren't quite sure how long they're going to last. I think that may be the big problem, but they're interesting, and it just gives you an idea that you can almost use anything to grow in as long as you work your soil right and as long as you have good drainage.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Okay, so square foot gardening, that's really what you guys wanted to hear about. I want to give you a little bit of history because square foot gardening, some people, there's a recent book out, and some people think, well, it's a brand new concept. Well, it really isn't. It started in 1890s, at least the evolution of it started with the French, and they had a method of gardening called the intensive gardening method. And basically it was a way of putting more plants in less space. And that kind of got developed further in Switzerland about maybe 30 years later in the early 1900s, and they called it biodynamic gardening. And they combined that intensive gardening with putting more plants in less space with organic gardening, actually. But they were using like horse manures and, all different types of manure type fertilizer as their organic gardening method. So when it came to the United States, it came in somewhere between the 30s and the 60s. And for a few years, they kind of used these methods, and they didn't really call it anything else. They just kind of combined these methods together. And in the 70s, early 70s, someone came up with the title. I mean, I don't know who the guy originally was, but there's a book on it called The Postage Stamp Gardener. And that's when they got into the concept of doing things kind of in a square format, look like a postage stamp. But again, it was this combination of intensive gardening method, putting multiple plants in one area, and using some organic gardening methods for fertilizer and things like that. So in the 80s, early 80s, a guy named Mel Bartholomew, who's still around today and just wrote a revised edition, matter of fact, for I think he wrote one for children, and then now it's just called Advanced or something. But he wrote this book about square foot gardening. And he took these methods and they kind of evolved. They evolved into some vertical growing and a whole lot of concepts about square foot gardening that the other methods had not done. And so he's kind of the father of the terminology square foot gardening. And I actually got his book in the 70s. But I didn't have a lot of time. I was working then. I didn't have a lot of time to do a lot of development, but I did it for the same reason that you guys are talking about doing it. Is I didn't have a lot of space and I didn't have a lot of time. So I wanted some method where I could grow things I was interested in using and not, have it be a farm, because I didn't have that much space to grow in. And it works really well. The things that one of the there's a lot of advantages, but the biggest one is space, time, and money, because you don't have to have a big plot. You don't have to invest a whole lot of money in fertilizer and lots of plants and all of that kind of stuff. The other real advantage I found in it is that you can have a big variety of crops. You don't have to have 50 tomatoes, although I would kind of like that since I'm a tomato guru. But you can have, you can have 1 or 2 or 3 tomatoes, and then you can have cucumbers and beans and squash and almost all the summer crops all at one time and all in one area. So all you have to do is know the proper spacing, which I'll get into a little bit, and of course be able to control the water and the fertilizer and the bugs. So because it is an intensive gardening practice, meaning you're putting more plants in smaller spaces than you typically would in a crop where you're doing long rows of planting and a lot of space between those rows, you have less weeding because the plants themselves shade the ground and less weeds grow. So anything that reduces weeds, I'm always all for, because weeding is one of the the things that gardeners learn to hate. You use fewer seeds, so you have less thinning to do. You use fewer plants, and you've got less transplanting to do. It takes less water, and you can have a continual harvest depending on what plants you grow and when you plant them. So there's a lot of advantages to doing square foot gardening. Here is the more typical design of square foot gardening. it's on the right, it's, just a regular garden bed that's square in nature. And so you can visually see the squares. Someone has actually made the wooden lines across and down the garden, so you can actually see what 1 square foot looks like. After you've done this a while, you get a pretty good feel for what 1 square foot looks like. So you don't really need that. When we do it with the kids, we make them measure it, because it's it's kind of a math lesson for them to determine how many squares you have. So for example, if you have a bed that's 5 foot by 7, then of course we teach them to multiply 5 by 7, and that's 35. So they have actually 35 squares in a 5 by 7 bed to plant in. And then from there we determine how many plants you can get in each square, depending on what the variety is. So the one on the right is the more traditional square foot garden. The one on the left was interesting because it's a raised, it starts out at one level, and then it goes up, it doubles, and then it triples, and then you have one at the top. And I never did count these, but it looks like there's probably at least 25 squares in this one area. And what this allows you to do is to grow taller plants in different places. And one of the important design principles of square foot gardening, since the plants are all there together in a smaller bed, is to start in the north side and have all your taller plants be on the north side of the bed, and then your shorter plants be on the south side of your bed, so that everything gets equal sunshine and nothing is shading anything. You can actually use pots. A single 5-gallon pot is, if you measure it, even though it's round, is 1 square foot. So you could even use pots to do square foot gardening, but beds are more traditional. Here's another example, and I'm going to tell you what I don't like about this in a minute. But this is a 4 by 6 bed, so there's 24 squares. There's 6 this way and 4 this way. So there's 24 squares to plant in. It's a traditional size of a bed. A lot of people have that size bed. What it shows here is that you also can grow up. You can do a trellis alternative on the top. Now, the only reason I don't like this is because if you plant underneath that and those plants get tall, and then you have something growing over it, you're going to get a lot of shade underneath there. So that particular design, I don't think would work really well for some of the square foot gardening that you might want to do. Now, you could not plant underneath it and try to control the plants that are growing on the trellis, and that might, accommodate it. But I'm going to show you one in a minute that's a little better design, at least I think, and it's a lot easier. You don't have to worry so much about the sun. Irrigation. No matter what kind and size or whatever bed you have, you do need an irrigation system. Hand watering works, but the problem with hand watering, especially for some of us as we get a little older, is to get it to the roots of the plant. You don't want to water the leaves of the plant, because you're just going to have diseases if you do that. So you want to water the roots. So you really got to get down underneath the leaves of the plant to get to water it well. So that's why and to control how much you do of hand watering. So hand watering is probably not ideal, but if you don't have anything else, of course it's better than nothing. The better alternatives is either a drip system or a soaker hose system, because you can put those right where the plant is, It feeds the roots of the plant. It doesn't spray up to the leaves of the plant, and you can put it on a timer very easily so that you get consistent water every day. And that's what vegetables need. They need that consistency. They don't want to be wondering where their next drink is coming from. Okay, planting techniques for square foot gardening. We've already talked a little bit about determining the number of squares. That's actually pretty simple once you know what the size of your bed is. But what do you plant in the squares? That gets a little trickier because each plant requires a certain amount of space. So for instance, a pepper is a pretty good sized plant, and it needs all 12 inches of that growing space. You'll plant it right dead in the center, and those leaves will pretty much cover the entire 12 inches. For some peppers, if they're growing really well, it may even take 2 squares. Depends on the variety of peppers. One thing I always encourage the kids to do, and when I buy seeds from them, I try to find seeds that have more of a dwarf nature, because if you have a more dwarf plant, then it's going to fit easier in these squares without taking as much space, especially when you get into tomatoes and maybe melons and some of the really big plants. Carrots and radishes, those aren't any problem. They need to be 3 inches apart, and so 16 of those will fit in 1 square. So you can grow 16 carrots or radishes in 1 square foot. And for most people, that's pretty adequate. Now, if you're trying to feed, the whole neighborhood or everything, you might need more than 1 square, and you might want to plant 2 or 3. But for most people, that's 16 of radishes and carrots are fine. And you don't have to plant them all at one time either. You can stagger them so that 1 week you're going to get 4 radishes, and the next week you're going to get 4 radishes, etc. You don't have to plant all rows at one time. Square foot gardening really has no wasted space. You shouldn't actually see much of the ground at all because the plants are going to pretty much fill in the entire space that you've allotted for them. A gallon bucket, if you want to start with something, you can always start with a 5-gallon bucket because that's 1 square foot, and plant something in there, or plant radishes or carrots in there, and see how it works out. Here's a chart. I've got a couple charts because some of them I don't agree with as much as others. When you're talking watermelon, as an example, watermelon, they say in square foot gardening, you can have 1 plant for every 2 square feet. So they're saying 1 watermelon is only going to cover 2 square feet. Well, if you get a very small watermelon, that's possible. But if you get a large watermelon like that picture shows, it's going to take way more than 2 square feet. I wouldn't even start it with less than 4 square feet. So you're going to see a lot of different charts that have, different impressions about how much you can grow. Now, if you grow that vertically, and you can grow watermelon vertically, it takes a little effort, but you can grow them vertically, then yeah, probably you could do 2 square feet for 1 watermelon because you can trim the leaves and things like that. Same with zucchini and pumpkin. In general, they take a lot more space than 2 square feet. But if you grow them vertically, you can probably get by with that. Even tomatoes, tomatoes, some of the bigger tomatoes, like your big beef and some of the indeterminate tomatoes, they take a lot of room because they grow every which direction. A celebrity tomato you probably could keep contained in 1 square foot by trimming some of the leaves. Most eggplants you can grow in 1 square foot, but that's 1 plant for 1 square foot. broccoli, cabbages, all those, even okra. Okra gets pretty tall, but it's not real wide. Cucumbers, again, I would do that vertically to try to get it in 1 square foot. Not, I wouldn't try it otherwise because I don't think it would fit very well. When you start getting into your smaller plants, though, these work pretty well. Your lettuces, most of your lettuces are 6 inches apart. So you're going to leave 3 inches on each side, and then you're going to make 6 inches in between, and then you're going to put the lettuce, 3 inches in, and you're going to get 4 lettuces. And most lettuces, that's be fine. They would work really well. Some of the smaller basils would work well. Now we've grown some really big basils that have taken every bit of 1 square foot. So again, it depends on your variety. You need to kind of be careful what kind of varieties you're picking before you cram in too much, because you don't want them to shade out other plants or be too close to each other. Corn is kind of interesting. I've done corn a number of times, and people say, "Oh, you need at least a whole foot for a corn." Well, if you have 1 square foot and you plant corn on the corners of each one of those, and then you don't plant again until the next corner over, you can actually plant corn. You need to do in rows of 2 or 3 at least. 3 is better because they cross-pollinate. But you could do it on the corners of say 3 squares, and you'd actually have quite a bit of corn, and they would cross-pollinate, and they would be fine. They would grow just fine. I've grown popcorn in the square foot garden at the extension for the children. I think we had a red one and we had a blue one, and it was kind of cool. And they don't get as tall either. They only get about 4 or 5 foot tall instead of 7 or 8 foot tall. So they worked out fine. But if you're going to grow corn, it's one of the taller varieties you would grow in the summer. So it would definitely need to be on the north side of your garden. They've got strawberries here. Strawberries that works pretty well, 4 in a square. Potatoes, I take a little exception to that. They're a little bit bigger than that. I'm not so sure I'd try to get more than 2 in a square. Turnips, you could definitely get 4 in a square. Then you go to the plants that would fit in like beans, bush beans. Beets and spinach, all of those you can get 9 in a square because they're not spread out as much. They're more like 4 inch or 3 inch. And then the 16 in a square are your 3 inch. Those are your radishes, carrots, and onions. And those pretty much will work with that kind of spacing. Here's another chart, and this one actually was put out by Mel Bartholomew, and this must be in his new book, All New Square Foot Gardening. And he explains a little bit better, I think, the spacing, because you can read on a seed package, and if the spacing on the seed package says put the seeds 3 inches apart, then you're in this range right here. You're in the small plant range. 3 inches apart are your carrots, your radishes, your onions. Those are all your small plants. If your seed package says 4 inches apart, you're in the 9 plants per square. And those are typically your bush beans and spinach and beets. And then your 6 inches are the ones we kind of just talked about. But we didn't talk about Swiss chard, but that's more of a fall vegetable. But those are your lettuces mostly. And then you start getting into your larger varieties, which are your peppers and your cabbages. Now, what he suggests over here is that the vertical growing is that you grow things like any of your cucurbit family. So your squashes, your melons, your cucumbers, all of those, they take at least a square foot, and they need to be grown vertically, because if you let them sprawl, then they're going to grow all over the other vegetables you have and possibly carry diseases you don't want, to be spread. So you definitely want to do these vertically. And he's saying that you could do tomatoes and gourds, pole beans in 1 square foot. And she says 2 cucumbers. So that I pretty much agree with that. I've been able to do that. We grow tomatoes vertically quite a bit. And matter of fact, right now we have 2 beds that are 16 foot by 5 foot. And we are growing those vertically on strings, baler's twine actually, which is kind of an interesting concept. But we trim those tomatoes. They're all indeterminate tomatoes. To grow tomatoes vertically, you really need indeterminate. Indeterminate, are the ones that are vining, the more vining tomatoes. They're not the bush tomatoes like your celebrities or Dixie Reds or some of those. They're the vinings like Big Beef, or a lot of your heirlooms are vining tomatoes. Some of your cherries are vining tomatoes. They grow over a longer period of time. They give you less fruit at one time, but they continue to grow a lot longer. The bush kind of gives you all your fruit all at one time. So we've been able to do that, and we have 20 tomatoes growing in. We have 2 beds, so we have 40 total tomatoes growing in that area. So we've got them spaced about 9 inches apart, and then we trim the leaves so that they don't get so bushy, so you get good air circulation. It's a lot of work. It's a lot more work than just sticking it in the ground with a cage and letting it go wherever it wants to go. But you get a lot better produce out of it, and the produce you get is a lot larger because you're trimming those leaves off, and you're trimming some of the first fruit off. So you get bigger tomatoes. So when you do squash or watermelon or pumpkins, I've only done the small pumpkins. I've never done any large pumpkins. We've used pantyhose to tie them up. That gets them off the ground and gets them on the trellis, and the pantyhose expand, and it works really well. Here's a better example of vertical growing, in my opinion anyway, where it's straight up and it's to the back of the bed, or at least I think this one is actually in 1 foot, so you're growing on the outside of it. So these are the plants that are going to be grown vertically out here on the far edge. But what this does is that you can then plant those on the north side of that bed, and the things on the south side over here will still grow and get plenty of light and plenty of water or anything else that because they won't be shaded out by that vertically growing plant. So this is what we use at the extension, except ours is taller. I think we have like a 6 or 7 foot trellis, and we've got a couple of them, and we just put them on the backs of the beds on the north side, and then we grow pole beans or cucumbers or something like that, sometimes tomatoes, on that trellis, and trim them so that they get good air circulation. You still need that air circulation no matter how you grow it, whether you're growing it vertically or whether you're growing it just on the ground. Here's just some examples of how you could space these across the back. You can actually, on the 1 foot marker, you can do a little trench across there, and in that trench then you drop your seeds like pole beans every 2 inches across the back. And yes, it's using more than 1 square foot, but it's not using the entire square foot because it's only using the back part, and then it's growing vertically from there. And the trench will allow the seed to stay in place. And that's important, because if you just drop some seeds and then you start watering, or it rains really heavy or what, all of a sudden you'll find that your pole bean is way over here, oops, on the other end, and you can't get to it. So, okay, rotation, crop rotation. I'm sure you've probably heard of this, and we all struggle with this a lot because we know we should do it, but it's hard, especially with summer crops, because we all like to grow the same things. I mean, we like to grow what we like to eat, right? And when you like things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, they're all in the same family. They're in the nightshade family. And when you start growing cucumbers, melons, and squash, they're all in the same family. And both of those families have the same bugs. So if you plant a tomato one year and you turn around in the second season and you plant a pepper, and then you turn around and plant a cucumber, by that next year, see, sometimes we can get 3 seasons in Texas, in our area here, of planting. But if you plant the same thing 3 times in one season, then by the next year, you may have problems. You may have nematodes in your soil. You may have stink bugs that have overwintered. I'm hoping this Arctic freeze we had has gotten rid of the stink bugs, because they're terrible at the extension. Even though we do rotate crops, it's still one big garden, and they know where the good stuff is, and so they come out almost immediately. So you do have to be careful, though. You do have to be careful to try to minimize what you're planting year after year. Good rotation crops in between are things like southern peas. They actually improve the soil somewhat if you will when they die back, if you will till them in your soil, or just hand work them into your soil, they add some fertility back to your soil. And of course, they're a different family than your tomatoes and your peppers. Corn generally is a good one because it's a grass family, and it's one of the few that's in the grass family. But corn does have some of the same bugs that the others, squash and tomatoes do. What we try to do is we do our best to rotate. If we've had a bed that had nightshade family in it, then we make sure that we put the cabbage family in there for the fall, and we may even in between put peas or beans or something to give some fertility to the soil. Farmers do this naturally, and we don't even think about it, because farmers typically have one major crop a year, and then they put a cover crop on. Well, that's what that cover crop is doing. It's doing the same thing as what we're talking about here. It's rotating their field so that the following year they can come back and plant their one main crop. Here in Texas, it's harder because we try to keep our gardens at the extension planted year round. Matter of fact, we had some great looking snap peas going when that Arctic freeze hit. They were just ready to they had bloomed, and they were just taken off, and that Arctic freeze hit, and boy, it killed every one of them. So we do try to keep our gardens fully planted, and I expect you all do too, because you're trying to provide food for your families. So anyway, I could talk this one to death, and I know how hard it is to do because we even have trouble doing it, but it's really important to keep your diseases down and keep your soil healthy. Okay, planting at the right time. Okay, this is a chart. We have one at the extension too. If you need, you could always call the extension. I'll give you those numbers in a minute. But we did this chart for the square foot gardening specifically because it tells you how many plants to plant. If it says P, that means that it, like for instance, broccoli, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 down. It says P at the end of the 215 to 315 time frame. That means that's the time frame for putting a plant in the ground, not seeds. Typically, broccoli you'd want to start in seeds about 6 weeks before that in a greenhouse, and then put it in the ground as a plant. Other things like beans, etc. You can just put seeds in the ground. You don't really need to transplant. You don't need a plant to transplant. The M at the end, there's a few that say M. That means that it's a marginal time frame. Some years it works, some years it doesn't work. I take these dates with a grain of salt because until the Arctic freeze, we were warmer than usual. And so we would try to back things up as far as we could so that we had a good jump on our heat. But you go down to tomatoes and it says you can put them in the ground from 2.1 to 228. Well, boy, that would have been that wouldn't have been too good this year since we had the Arctic freeze right in the middle of that. But I'll tell you, we got our tomatoes in right after that. We put them in the very last week of February because tomatoes are one of those things that if you can get it jump started, and this last 2 weeks have been perfect because we've had temperatures between 45, 50 to 75, and that's what tomatoes love. And the ones at the extension were already blooming this week. So it's worth it to get them in as early as possible, just in case our heat, comes early, which it does a lot. So this is a good chart though for almost anything. I would vary it a couple weeks depending on our weather. As I say, if we get really cold weather in February, then move it 2 weeks further out. If we start getting really warm weather, then you might want to move it earlier and try to beat the heat. But crops that people don't think of a lot about that you can do later are things like your cantaloupes. You can have 2 seasons for cantaloupes. You can do an early one, or you can do a later one as late as June 30th. The same thing with pumpkins and black-eyed peas. We use black-eyed peas or the summer peas for our summers, just to keep the weeds down, if nothing else. And they grow really, really well in the summer. They like the heat. Okra is another one that likes the heat. And so I won't even waste time or bed space planting okra in April because we still have a lot of the other plants that we really want to produce, which are usually your tomatoes and peppers and eggplant. So I'll wait and do okra later in the summer when nothing else is really growing very well. It's all kind of come to a stop. So this is a very helpful chart. It also tells you, since we do it with the kids, it tells you how deep to plant the seeds. Sometimes we have a lot of trouble with children. They want to either push it down really far or they want to lay it right on top. So this chart comes in handy. Varieties from Montgomery County. This comes in handy if you can find them. The varieties are getting harder and harder to find. The seeds are getting harder and harder to find. But some really good ones that we've planted this year that I can highly recommend is on a pole bean. It's called Northeaster. They produce a really good pole bean in less than 60 days. So they're really good. Rattlesnake beans are another pole bean that's really good. Let's see if there's anything else I can. Ambrosia is a really good cantaloupe if you can find it. We've done a few new varieties that aren't on here yet, which we need to add. But sometimes it takes about 3 seasons to actually test a new variety and have any. You've just got to get our weather. Our weather changes so frequently. You've got to get every condition you can possibly get before you can recommend a new variety. And some of the older varieties are getting harder and harder to find. So one thing that people like to do, and that's the only reason I've included this, there's really no science behind this. I guess they've tried some different things to see if they could determine a science about companion planting, but there really isn't. Most of this is just trial and error to see. I mean, I think most of us that have grown tomatoes know that if we do have some of the different herbs with them, especially basil, that it seems to make the flavor of the tomato a little bit better. Now, whether that's just us imagining it or not, I don't know. But what this chart shows is the green ones, like for instance, if you go, let's go to bush beans. If you see the ones in green, so the beets, the cabbage family, carrots, celery, corn, cucumber, eggplant, lettuce, peas, potatoes, radish, tomatoes. The greens say that beans will tolerate these other vegetables or herbs, depending on what they are, that you can grow them together in close proximity and they won't have any negative effect on each other. The yellow ones are okay. They won't really enhance it, but they aren't going to hurt it. And the red ones, they found actually stunt the growth a little bit of these, like onions with beans for some reason, stunts the growth of the beans. So I'd say take this with a grain of salt, but the important thing to note is that if you put herbs, let's talk herbs more than anything else, with some of your vegetables, it does deter some of the bugs, because some of the bugs don't like the smell of certain herbs, like dill maybe, or even garlic. That's not an herb, but it's a vegetable. Garlic and onions. We kind of scatter onions and garlic around our gardens. We also use so in the fall we use nasturtiums. We'll use marigolds in the spring because they're such a strong fragrance that they bring in the good bugs, like your ladybugs and your bees, but some of the other bugs are not as prevalent when you've got those sprinkled around your gardens. So that's my only reason for showing you this, because sometimes people like to interplant herbs with their vegetables, and you definitely can do that. And in most cases, it won't hurt them. Of course, they will take space, but it won't hurt the flavor, and sometimes it even helps the flavor. Here's some examples of ones we used for veggie companions in the fall. We had mint. We were planting the cabbage family, the broccoli, the cauliflower, the kales, Brussels sprouts, turnips, and we interplanted with mint and rosemary, I think, and then that's sage, and they were pretty, and it didn't hurt any of them. They all did very well. Okay, here's a good time if anybody's got questions. I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Hey Lynn, this is Jenny. I have a question. I know that you mentioned planting the taller things on the north side and the shorter things on the south side. Do you have any other suggestions about placement of plants to utilize the space the best you can?
Well, it is kind of, if you remember that very first chart, if you look at the plants you want to plant and you determine what their final height is going to be, or at least, you know, generally, it doesn't have to be precise, but generally, and then scale your bed accordingly. So like if you know you're going to do tomatoes and you know they're going to be big ones, they're going to be, you know, 6-7 foot tall. You know, you start with those on the north side, and then you scale back. Then you go your peppers, because they're going to still be maybe 5 foot tall, and then you go down to something that's going to be only 3 foot tall. So you kind of scale it down so that the smallest things are at the very, you know, south end, so that they get the maximum amount of sun. But other than that, there's really nothing. There's nothing magical. It makes it look really pretty if you have a garden that looks scaled, you know, looks higher at the end and then it scales down lower at the other side. It also looks very pretty. Now I try to intermix different colors. I love, you know, trying to make vegetables look like, you know, floral. And so I'll use different colors. Like I may interplant one of the nasturtiums that has a really pretty bright red and orange color, or I might put in a marigold that has the two-toned yellow with red. I like okra that has the bright red okra pods. And then there's some okra that have some really pretty flowers that have they're kind of a lemon with a dark yellow. And so we've interplanted some of those kind of things just for the color and just for the flowers. More so, artichokes are beautiful. Now they are big, they get really big. So they're probably not what I would call a square foot garden plant. But if you've got a little more space, I would always try to tuck a artichoke in or two because their flower is so pretty. Does that answer it?
Thank you. Yep, thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else have any questions? I guess not, Lynn. You just covered everything so fantastically.
Well, I don't know.
That was really good. Learned a lot.
Yes,
about that, but hopefully you got the gist of what square foot gardening is, and there on this chart there's 2 videos that you could go out and view. One is just a kind of promo by Mel Bartholomew about square foot gardening, and the other one's about by My Planet, and it has to do with this intensive gardening and how you can grow a lot of different things in a smaller space. So you might take a look at those, and then of course you can always ask questions at the extension. Here's all the extension links, and they man the phones every day of the week. Even during the pandemic, we had somebody manning the phones. So
well, thank you so much. I especially liked your chart that included when to plant, but for the square foot gardening part too. That was really helpful because I haven't seen anything like that before.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay,
all right.
Well, good luck to you all in planting your gardens this spring. Everybody needs to get started soon because I think this next week is going to be perfect for planting.
Looks like it. Thank you so much, Lynn. Really appreciate it. And I know I learned a lot.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Lynn.
All right. Come see us at the gardens.
Oh, we will. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.